Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Tolkien Collector's Guide YouTube channel. We're very excited to have with us today Christina Scull and Wayne Hammond to talk about the recently published Collected Poems of J.R.R. Tolkien. So I'd like to say hello and let you guys introduce yourselves.
Oh, hello, everybody. Good to be here.
And hello from me. My
So,
voice was very deep, that.
yeah, it's great to have you. We've all had a chance to start reading through this, but I'd love to hear from you guys sort of the genesis of this project. When you first had the idea, or if HarperCollins asked you to do it, just give us a little bit of the history, the early history.
Well, we go back to 2016 for that. We were in London, and HarperCollins wanted to
Did we
did we lose him?
let's see what all right, we did a good tech check, but we still managed to lose Wayne and Christina. So give us a second while we try and get them reconnected here.
We promise it won't take as long from 2016 to now.
That's true.
As long as the whole process.
So let's get you guys back in here. Are they coming?
Possibly.
All right. We're going to try again to reconnect them. I apologize for this, but we're very excited to have them. This is somewhat unusual for our live streams, but they are reconnecting to the stream right now, and hopefully that will go smoothly. I don't know if you all were excited to see the bookshelves behind them, but
yeah, that was. I've got a couple of questions on my list already about their bookshelves. I mean, obviously, I'm into.
If anyone can guess all the books,
obviously I'm into the poetry, but I'm also very much into the shelves behind them too.
All right, we happy to have you back. Let me.
Got you.
Can you guys hear us? Okay.
Okay. Yeah. I don't know what happened. Everybody went dark. Our internet stayed up. It was fine.
Yeah, no, that was it. Unfortunate little technical hiccup, but you're here now. We can hear you and see you just fine. So yes, our question was the origins, and you were talking about 2016.
Actually, it comes slightly that when we were going to London in 2016, we were going to see HarperCollins, but we also had a message from them just before we went that Christopher was interested in having something done about the poems. We did know about it, because I remember looking up poems before we even saw them, but we weren't sure what it was that was wanted.
Well, there was that. I mean, that there were two things that occurred. One was that our editors informed us that our Tolkien Companion and Guide that had come out in 2006 was now out of print, and instead of merely reprinting, since they knew we'd done addenda and corrigenda on our website over the years, they thought that a revised edition would be good, which surprised us. But we're happy to do it. But then at the same time, Christopher Tolkien had expressed interest in seeing more of his father's poetry published, of seeing his father's talents as a poet better recognized. So we talked with HarperCollins a little about that, and agreed that it would be a very good thing to do. It was an odd situation in that we were then not dealing with HarperCollins, but with the Tolkien estate, and to be in touch with Christopher and advise him on what we thought would be the best way to publish these and more poems. We had talked with HarperCollins at our meeting about should it be only a select group of poems. They were interested at the time, particularly in the World War I era, because certainly the early poems had not been published as much as the later ones. Would it be one volume? Would it be two volumes? Would it be a series of volumes coming out over a period of time? In any case, we were in touch with Christopher and began a back and forth about what we thought could be done. Mainly, we had to wait for a large batch of material to be brought from France, from Christopher's home, to the Bodleian Library in Oxford to be scanned and then copies sent to us.
I think one thing that may have contributed to this happening is that when we were doing our first companion and guide, and we had the chronology, we knew that Tolkien had done poems early, that it was, and we felt that it would not be a good biographical chronology if we couldn't at least show it. And some poems we knew because they were published, but there were other things we didn't know. And Christopher did arrange for us to have a list of poems that we included. I think he appreciated the fact that we realized that poetry was an important part of his father's works.
Also, in 2014, we had edited the pocket edition of The Adventures of Tom Bombadil.
Mm-hmm.
It's something actually that we had proposed way back when we had finished Artist and Illustrator, and Rainer Unwin asked us, well, what next? What do you want to do now? Because you really should put some proposals forward to HarperCollins, saying something we've quoted many times, that publishers need authors as much as authors need publishers. Mm-hmm. In other words, they need content. So we had put a number of proposals forward for annotated editions, including an annotated Lord of the Rings. Finally, the time was right for Bombadil, or they thought it was. It wasn't a particular anniversary year, but they wanted to do it. And that gave us the opportunity of, as you'll know, not only reprinting in a pocket format the standard 1962 Bombadil collection, but also, where applicable, adding early versions of the poems, mm-hmm. Selected early versions, not all of them by any means, mm-hmm. Plus commentary. So that gave a sort of introduction to the kind of work that we would eventually do with the collected poems.
And in fact, while we were doing it, we knew of we knew quite a lot of poems that had been published, earlier versions. But while we were doing it, I was reading an unpublished essay by Rona Beer, and she had noticed that one of the poems seemed very a connection between Once Upon a Time, which was part of that trio, quadruple, or whatever you like to call it, when everything was connected in the middle, mm-hmm. had similarities with the poem published with no, it wasn't. That wasn't called Once Upon a Time. It was. I can't think of the title of that the old poem in a minute. But she connected it with Once Upon a Time and thought there was some connection. Mm-hmm. And I looked at it and I thought, she's right. And I went upstairs to Wayne and said, I think we better ask Christopher if we can add another poem to this book, because it is a forerunner. Mm-hmm. And actually, it was very funny because when we got the poems on that earlier poem, Tolkien himself had written, and this eventually became Once Upon a Time.
That's awesome.
But I think it was good for us for poems. It suggested.
Yes, and showed Christopher the sort of work that could be done in the kind of book that we eventually did for the collected poems.
What was your focus on the collected poems? Because I've seen, reviews have talked about the poems themselves and the commentary and the very scholarly deep dive into the history and the crafting and the changes, etc. And it works to us three. We've talked about this. It works really well as all of the above, where we can dive deep on a poem when it's we want to read the history, and then we can just browse through and read actual Tolkien's published poems and unpublished poems. But did you have a particular focus or goal when you were working on the actual format that we ended up with?
Well, the basic idea was that we were following Christopher's lead in the history of Middle-earth, but doing rather more with the poems that he had the space or the purpose to do. We could concentrate on the poetry as opposed to part of the larger history of Middle-earth, part of the legendarium. We had discussions about how much should be done. You could start out and saying, well, shall we just publish the last version of a poem? Well, that would be interesting, and certainly could be done. But if Christopher wanted his father's talent as a poet to be better known and appreciated, then you really had to show the evolution of each poem. Starting with the earliest surviving version. Sometimes there were certainly earlier versions that the manuscripts at the least weren't available to us, that weren't known, that the locations weren't known, or they've been lost. You'll begin with that and go to the last version, maybe a published version. Although in some cases, even a published version was not the last version because Tolkien, kept revising. Should it be a larger concept, which it turned out to be? We were inclined towards that. I suppose it's just the sort of people we are. And Christopher, as it turned out, was also, although he said along the way that he was alarmed at the amount of work that was coming along, if we were going to do something like that.
I mean, one difficulty was, if you were going to do even a wide selection, how do you make the wide selection? What do you leave out? In the end, it was easier to put everything in than to sit around arguing. Is this really, I know there are some very strange things in there, but they're all part of Tolkien. And I think it really gives you a picture.
Yeah, but the only thing we were, it was saying about how many volumes it was going to be. Well, is it going to be one volume? It would be a very thick volume. HarperCollins from the start were happy to have multiple volumes. We thought for a long time it might be 2 volumes. And then it was clear after a while that it was not going to be only 2 volumes. It couldn't be. For one thing, you have certain limitations in the number of pages you can get into a volume comfortably, or with considering thickness of paper and all that. And we were able most easily just to leave out the better part of the poems in The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings, because everybody's got that, at least one copy, sometimes many more, so that and not everybody agrees with that. They would prefer a complete poems, but in that case, you would have had at least 4 volumes. And of course, the bigger the book, the greater the cost. So it was all a balancing act in the end.
I was interested in how you worked out the variants for the poems. What was your criteria for that? In terms of if it's an A or a B or so on, how did you arrive at that?
We decided that we would attempt a chronological arrangement as best could be figured out, and then we had the manuscripts in front of us and lay them out and say, well, this one follows that one. And although that wasn't entirely easy because Tolkien sometimes went back to an earlier version and inserted his changes to a later version. But and you look at the inks being used and pencil and you try to figure it out. And then how many do you include? We've had some criticism about including things that are virtually the same. Well, you've got two ways of doing it. Either you can print both and say, here's the second version with slight changes, though enough changes that they're noticeable if you compare the two. Or you can say there's another version, a second version, and here is a list of the changes by line number. And that wasn't really very practical, and is I think we thought was tedious. It could be that one or two of those versions could have been left out. We had to feel our way from when we started, and we started out with rather more, including rather more than we were inclined to do later. But I think in the end we included what we thought were sufficiently discrete versions and sufficiently meaningful variations to show how Tolkien went from one version to another version to another version. And sometimes, as you know, he had many versions. There were some of these, like Criterion, that took a long time to work through. Even Beorhtnote, where we only did excerpts, took a while to figure out, and then decide, how are you going to present these things. But
I think it's great because you can now, if you take something like The Dragon's Visit, before there was two published poems with the same name and completely different endings. So how do you refer to which one? Well, now you can, because you've got 10 variants now in your book, which you can say exactly which one you're talking about. And I think this is really useful actually to actually have that now.
Was there a particular one? Was there a particular poem that you can recall that was challenging and gave you trouble, and it really took more time than you expected to figure out the modifications, changes, revisions that he was working on?
What do you think? I mean, there were a couple that were just because there were so many versions. Criterion, Errantry and the Song of Eärendil. I think one of the poems that took us a long time to do was the one that began with Grimness of the Sea.
Oh gosh, yes.
And ends with the Horns of Ilmir. And we worked out that by the time you get from the first to the last.
Well, I think Christopher's commented on it.
One half of one line survived. And it raises the question that, if you were to do a selection of poems, are they the same poem anymore?
And then, of course, we had things like The Lonely Chapel, which is
Empty Chapel.
An empty chapel, yes. It is. It's a terrible manuscript, almost in a few lines and almost illegible. And yet, from the beginning, I could feel that there was something there. I mean, to me, it brought memories of the Arthurian romance and of don't mean William Morris, I want the other one. Burne-Jones paintings. Sorry, I just suffer from lack of memory at times.
I do as well, yeah.
And yet it was also relevant to the war, the sound of the marching feet. And I said, we've got to put it in. It's just goes off to nothing at the end. We don't know where it was intended to go, but I found it incredibly moving.
Absolutely. Yeah, we've got a comment from Carl as well on Theseus's poem. He was bringing that up as probably another challenging one. And then Ian, you can see his question on screen. I'll read it out for people who are just listening. He wanted to hear if there were personal favorites that you hadn't seen before as you were working through this book.
Well, you liked the Empty Chapel. That was an interesting one, and challenging one in that, as you say, it doesn't really go anywhere. So do you leave it out because it isn't developed, or do you put in extracts? And we chose to do the extracts so as not to lose that. What's your thinking about poems that we hadn't seen before?
Somehow I've seen them for so long now, I can't hardly remember which ones.
It's been 8 years for this project.
It's such a long project.
I mean, of course, the thing that blew us and everybody in the reviews is Jabberwocky in Old English.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, that's great.
Mm-hmm.
And we, it was only by luck that we got it in. And when, it just had to go in as an appendix because the approval
it was too late. Once you number the poems and put in cross-references in the commentary to poems, you don't want to insert something and then have to change all those numbers.
And if Wayne typeset the whole of the book.
That's huge.
In addition, if you hadn't known that,
it's. I've done that for a number of our books with HarperCollins, and it's a convenience.
That's
we can write to fit.
That I was thinking about that when I was reading through volume 1 and just the poetry in general and kind of just generally y'all's works over the last 20-30 years. I'm interested to know what y'all's editorial process is like, because everything y'all do it together as a team. So how does the process work? Do y'all do everything together, or?
Let me just we're jumping ahead. It was the last question about what poem struck you.
Oh,
I
yes.
was going to say that the one that struck me most was the Richard Before Jerusalem, because it's so long and so convoluted, and it's like Tolkien is trying to just get out all of this lavish language that's inside him, and that I did enjoy how we were able over the course of really the first volume to show how he, with criticism from Smith and Wiseman, managed to cure himself of that, to really tone it down and tighten things up.
Yep.
Editorial process, you were starting to say.
Yes.
Well, for the poet, it varies from what the work is. Actually, for the poetry, Wayne we decided at first, it didn't come for a long time. We had to wait about 4 or 5 months before it.
Yeah, we had our meeting with HarperCollins in the spring of 2016, and then the poems didn't come for several months. And we had that commission at that same time to do the second edition of the Companion and Guide. And I was still working.
This was what I was going to say. So actually, what we did at the time, we split it. Wayne worked for a long while just on revising the Companion and Guide, which was something he could fit in the evenings, though each of us revised the bits that we'd written before. And I, who could be full-time, went through a thing of transcribing poems.
Organize them.
Looking at them, in fact, comparing them. I did a line by line, version 1, line 1, version 2, line 1, version 3, and wrote them underneath each other after I transcribed, which immediately showed up where the changes were. And Collected was hell with that because he moved things around a lot. And I would also sort of look up words I thought we might need to read and think of anything I thought to say. And any particular, if it immediately came to my head, any writings about these poems. And then it went to Wayne, and from that he wrote the entry. So I did the sort of preliminary work, and Wayne did the writing.
At which point I had all of the manuscripts in front of me. I mean, we had very helpfully from the estate and the Bodleian. They gave us the scans as TIFFs, as JPEGs, and as PDFs. So if needed, I could bring something into Photoshop and manipulate it and make it darker and bring up faint pencil. That was a great thing to be able to do.
Absolutely.
And then once I had it in front of me and I could see the structure of everything, which wasn't easy with things like Quarterian and errantry. Then I just wrote the entry, and then it went to Christina, and we talked about it, and we revised it, and we did 36 poems initially.
Yes.
Because Christopher was still alive, and we were sending comments to him, and eventually we sent those 36 as a sample. He didn't want to do just one or two, but to show him the larger picture of how things could go, and also how long the book ultimately would be. This was not yet going to the publishers. Christopher wanted everything worked out with him first, and happily we were able to do that while he was alive. Unhappily,
the first 30 odd,
the 36, yes. But I mean, the whole concept of the book, the fact that it was going to be done in this way. I was
going to say, we also had made some decisions that we would not include. For the length, we wouldn't include all the poems from The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit, because that would add in. We thought most people who would buy the book would have copies of those, and therefore we would pick the most relevant ones. And we also made the decision that the longer poems should be represented by selections, because it was part of the way things developed.
And we decided that we shouldn't omit poems just because they were in Elvish or in Old or Middle English,
right,
or Gothic, or what have you, or Latin, so that we really wanted to show the breadth of Tolkien's talents and abilities.
Yeah, as a linguist, the different languages. I noticed, I haven't read the whole book cover to cover yet, or volumes collected, but you provide translations, or an attempt at a translation for many of those, the ones I've come across. Is that from you? Did you work with other scholars? Did you pull from published, for his poems, especially the unpublished ones? What was your process for those translations?
I think there's just one poem in Elvish that was Tolkien himself did not do an English version that we include. I think that's right. And that was Chris Gilson, who kindly gave permission for us to use it from, what was it?
Tengwar.
Anything in Old English, I did make an attempt at, but ultimately Arden Smith, one of the other Tolkien linguists, dealt with that, and it was, as you'll see in the appendix, it was Arden who tackled Jabberwocky in Old English, and then made a translation back from the Old English into modern English. Middle English, Latin, that's mainly me.
Excellent.
I think looking at something like, say, the Songs of Mythologists poems, it's really nice to be able to read the translations of them and not just have the original, because not all of us are able to actually read the Old English. And I think it's great that you put those in as well. So most poems actually have a translation in there.
Yep.
And that really adds a lot, I think, to the.
And Constantine's asking if there are other non-English poems that you are aware of that you didn't manage to fit into the book.
There were certainly other things in Elvish, other versions, that we didn't want to overdo that. that end of it, especially since it's much better handled by the team in Parma El de Lambaron,
Yeah.
or Vignard Tenoir. In Latin,
I can't think what the Latin.
there might be
There was, I think,
one,
but I
or, one or
can't
two
think
things.
Yeah,
There were also
there-
a couple, I think, that really didn't go anywhere.
Mhm.
And we
Yeah,
couldn't make anything out.
Yeah, the Latin one that I'm aware of in Volume 3, I can't think of the title, but I know that there's some that are in the book. So that's I for one really enjoy, even though I can't read Latin or Gothic or Old English, just seeing the construction, the flow, the meter, and then your analysis of it is very interesting to me. So I'm very happy those made it in there. For the ones that you explicitly excluded from the Lord of the Rings, just for length reasons, is there the construction history beyond what Christopher had in the history of the Lord of the Rings for any of those that you came across? Like,
Well, most of them are things like the Lays of Beleriand, and
sure.
which were.
You said the Lord of the Rings.
Yeah, the ones you excluded from the Lord of the Rings. Are there draft history for those beyond what Christopher had in his
There would
history
be.
for those?
There would be if that we made a selection of
Mhm.
what we thought was the best, most interesting of them. That the way
I
we
think
thought
that,
it.
of course, some of them had already been used previously.
Mhm.
Light as Leaf had in fact been written and then used once, and then it was
Thought
used
like
a
that,
second
yes.
time, so that quite a lot were like that.
But if we had included others, we would have gone to Marquette. We would have asked Bill Fliss, and each of those will have manuscript and typescript versions
Mhm.
in the Marquette files, and you would make up the same sort of thing for them. It's just we decided not to do those.
For good reason, I think. It's
Space.
We'd still be at it.
it's a future volume potentially from
It is, yeah.
Marquette to be able to see those, but so much of that is I think at least mentioned by Christopher when he was working on the history of Middle Earth and the history of the Lord of the Rings. So
we threw in some of the not counted in the things. We threw in some of the 2 or 3 line things which turned up when. For instance, when we were dealing with the lament for Boromir, we mentioned the other laments for
We slipped in the little bits, those extracts, short poems like the Rohirrim poems. With others, we just didn't have numbered entries for them, but they're there, as you'll know if you try to count how many poems are in this thing. It's everybody's going to get a different figure. But I think Bill Fliss has mentioned more than once that you can read the volumes of the history of the Lord of the Rings in the history of Middle Earth, but there's a lot more that has probably more that has not been published of the evolution of those books that then has been published.
yeah.
I was going to bring up I think a question that a lot of people would have, which is having read the book so far. I've not read all of it so far, but my favourite poem that I've read so far is Monday Morning. I can't believe that anything could go as badly wrong as because absolutely everything goes wrong in that poem. But it's great. It's a really, really interesting, and it's a completely different poem as well from what Tolkien normally writes. But what is your favourite poems? What are your favourites?
It's difficult to know exactly.
Yeah, when you worked on this many poems over this long a period of time, I mean, I always say I have a soft spot for errantry, but only because that was the poem that I took particular note of back when I started to read Tolkien, and Donald Swann set it to music. So when I see it and read it, I hear that and pretty much know it by heart. but of the newer poems, the unpublished ones, I don't know.
I mean, of the old ones, I like Light as Leaf and Quaterian. I'm very fond of Quaterian. And some things I'm sort of finding amused. I have become very fond of morning tea for two reasons. One is that although in America, of course, one doesn't get morning tea, but the sounds of the world, I've been in hospital twice in America, and one thing that did cause this is I was not well last autumn. I was in hospital last autumn, and it's the sort of sound of something in the morning when you think, goodness, the night's over, the day's coming. But it was also his thinking of how the tea and coffee got there is, of course, the Silk Route. And that's one of the things, a subject in which I'm very fond and are getting far too many books on.
Can't get too many books.
No.
Never enough.
One of the things that struck me when I was reading Volume 1 in particular was the y'all's introduction to the collected poems in general. It's beautifully written. It's very thorough.
Wayne,
Thank you.
Wayne,
did
you did a fantastic job on the introduction. I just wanted to know just kind of what goes into writing a good introduction to a work that you've edited, and like, do you have any advice for budding editors, budding authors about how to write a good introduction?
Well, there's really two things. The editing is one thing, and this was not the sort of editing that we had done so much of before. All the different versions of the same thing. You have to make certain decisions about how you're going to approach something. Christopher Tolkien did things his way, which was for the particular purpose that he had of in writing the history of Middle-earth. And in doing so, he would sometimes make silent corrections to this or that. We made a decision to try to transcribe everything as it is in the manuscript or the typescript, except on occasion adding a mark of punctuation or whatnot in square brackets just because it was needed for comprehension. So there are all sorts of decisions like that you have to come up with, and everybody's got a different way of going about it. We were not doing sometimes we thought it was useful to show Tolkien's changes in the manuscript. So we'll show where something was deleted and replaced and so on and so forth. For the most part, we didn't do that. These are all things that, are on a case-by-case basis. And you look at the way other people have done this sort of thing, and then you come up with something that's really appropriate for what your particular purpose is.
Actually, I just remembered I did do part. Sorry, I just remembered I did do part of the introduction, because I did the thing about the sort of sentence about you can distinguish in commas, full stops, and they're also indistinguishable marks that are 2 inches from the position where they should be. I remember doing some of those.
Yeah. I mean, you have to learn that Tolkien will sometimes, cross a T about 2 inches to the right of the letter, things like that. Is that a meaningful mark, or is it no? That's he's crossing the T. The introduction, though, it grows organically, and it grows from whatever the needs are of the work. You say, well, what do you want to put into it? What do you have to explain? Of course, the latter part of that is talking about how we came to be commissioned to do the work, how we decided on certain procedures.
So do y'all write it as you go, Wayne, or do you wait until you're done and then write it?
I wrote that not at the very end,
Okay.
but you allow that certain things might have to be mentioned. And it was a means of showing, of summarizing the in one place, because some of this is done in the actual entry commentaries. But summarizing in one place the development of Tolkien's poetry, Tolkien as a poet, from his limerick he sent to Father Francis, to those strange late poems that are actually somewhat disturbing, where he's my home is not here, and talking about Oxford once he's retired, feeling a bit down. But also it needed to have Tolkien's poetry put into context of English poetry of his time. And sure, people, there are some people who will say, well, you didn't do enough about this or that, or your definition of that is not my definition. I had a certain background in that as a librarian, I administered a number of poetry collections, especially people like Rupert Brooke, who was a contemporary, T.S. Eliot, who was not quite as applicable. So I could draw upon that. And then it's a matter of, reading up on everything that it's there, reading all the books that have been written about Tolkien's poetry, all the essays, and then because we had the actual poems in front of us, deciding what really needed to be said to help the reader.
Yeah, you mentioned getting, those digital scans, copies, etc., months after you started. So 2016, 2017, it sounded like. But
later in 2016, but it did take them a time to do.
Sure.
I mean, 1,000 pages or so, and 3 versions of each.
That was
Yep.
the Bodley and they had to fit it in. As I've just noticed for something I read, the Bodley usually has, well, this was some time ago, but the Bodley had about 4 or 5 months backlog sometimes in scanning work.
In imaging orders.
Mm-hmm. You had
so that was a great thing.
But we could look ahead and read, but we don't forget we had been given our companion and guide to do as well. Yeah. So we made a start on the companion and guide while we were waiting for the poetry. And that was quite a job too.
Well, and you had some late findings that you were able to include as well, right? Not from that initial batch, but things were discovered or came to light later on in the process.
You mean the Hooper stuff?
Mm-hmm.
We were given an early warning that they might come. The point is, it depended on who. I mean, there are 2 things for reproducing something. There's the writers or copyright, but there's also the right of the owner. And they were accepted in lieu of duty. This is to a British, for Britain, there is a system whereby things of cultural value, everything pays debt. If you pay debt, most things are dutiable when you die, within reason, death duties. But there is a thing whereby things of national interest relating to national authors, artists, or things may be accepted in lieu of death duties and are then assigned to the most suitable place for them to be kept. We knew that the Hooper thing was being considered. Somebody let us know, and I won't give his name. Let us know. We knew they were being, but we didn't know where they'd go. As soon as they went to the Bodley, it was straight. But we couldn't put them in until we were sure. Otherwise, we'd have to take them out.
Well, that was, there was another version of Dewhurst, which we'd written the entry for it already, and it just needed to be fitted in. and there was another copy of Adventures of Tom Bombadil, the poem, but it was the same as one we had, and Jabberwocky, which and the one about the ants.
Yes.
There's no cant about the ant, but it was a longer version, whereas we previously only had an extract.
Mm-hmm.
So there were places for all of these except for Jabberwocky. But so we got the group of things that we got initially from the estate through the Bodleian had a lot. There was a lot there, but there were also poems that we knew existed by Tolkien that weren't there, and so we had to make a request to the Bodleian for those, and we were very familiar with what had been published, so that had to build up over a period of time.
Were there any from Christopher? I know he had his own papers that weren't at the Bodleian, and that's obviously changed since his passing. But when you were still working with him, was he able to give you anything from his private collection?
He was not. He had got on in years and was not able to get up the stairs to the loft and look for papers.
And was desperately trying to finish the last of his
great
tales.
We didn't know it, but he was working on the Fall of Gondolin.
Mm.
So, and we had enough to do.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
So we didn't really want to bother him with that. And then he was gone.
Yeah.
But he did answer questions for us as far as he was able. He wasn't always able. Just kept at it as best we could. Had to get the companion and guide out of the way, do a new index, and so there are things that papers that might be in France. His archive is now being inventoried by Vincent Ferré, and they may show up. In which case, maybe there'll be a supplement. I don't know.
I would love to see a supplement someday. I'm sure many others will as well. So,
well, actually, even after the book went to press, we were getting information. We had inquired about the poem Dewhurst that Tolkien had done, as a spoof of Piers Plowman, and had sent a copy to his friend R.W. Chambers in London, and Chambers gave it to a colleague, and that colleague gave it to somebody else.
And it disappeared in Australia.
Ended up in Australia with Professor Brown, and we tried to track that down. Nothing happened. And then after everything went to press, turned out that somebody years ago had made a photocopy of that. We still don't know about the original, but a photocopy existed, and that found its way to us. And we analyzed that there were still differences again to the ones we published, and those are on our online addenda and core agenda.
Yeah, for you viewers, be sure to follow Wayne and Christina's website. We'll put the link in the show notes for your core agenda and addenda, because that's a fantastic resource for all of your books to follow along as they continually evolve.
Well, I think we're pretty much sort of running out of time, but there was one thing I did really want to mention before we finished, and that's the design of the book. I just think these books look absolutely stunning.
Well, the
inside the inside is mine. The outside,
and the outside as well is nice. Did you have any involvement with the outside of the books?
I made some suggestions about the topography, and we approved that. The idea that which was Chris Smith's to use the botanical illustrations.
They're fantastic. It's really good. The slipcase is nice as well. It's good to have this sort of thing, so you don't lose the books. You know where they are.
And it's I suppose it's the smoothness of the covers, but they slide in and out of the slipcase so nicely.
That they do.
Assuming and this is the slipcases without the extra gap that apparently happened with some copies.
Well, if you do have one of the slipcases with the extra gap, I think maybe it was Carl that pointed out that the addenda and cord, you can print it and fit it right into
Stick it in there.
Right in there with it.
You've got a gap for it.
Well, I hope that won't be I hope there won't be too much more core agenda for that. But Tolkien being Tolkien, and
well, you're bound to find new poems and things. It's inevitable, isn't it? New stuff's going to turn up, so it's good that you do that.
Mm-hmm.
You've got somewhere to add them to.
Well, and you can imagine, since our policy for the companion and guide was that we had a separate entry for each published poem, and now we have 70 some new poems. Each one will get an entry.
Yeah.
We've got a lot of work ahead when we can get to it.
Okay.
Actually,
Well,
quite a few people have. There were those lists at the end of beautiful words, and
Yes.
and other things which we think people probably would find fascinating, and decided to include.
Well, I think we are pretty much drawing to a close now. So we just wanted to say thank you again for the book,
Mm-hmm.
B for getting this, working with the estate and Christopher and HarperCollins to produce something, because without you doing this, we wouldn't really have anything much for poems. We've now got a fantastic resource on poems, and before we had little bits and you had to look in various books to find them. So it's great. And anyone who hasn't bought this book, you need to run out to the shops and buy it, because
What are you doing with yourselves? Go out and buy it.
Yeah, run out and buy it.
Yeah, absolutely. It's been a great pleasure talking with you. Thank you for taking some time out of your day to join us. We really appreciate not just the collected poems, but your scholarship over decades at this point in Tolkien and his works. So we really appreciate, again, you guys being able to join us, and thank you so much.
Well, thanks for inviting us.
You're very welcome. Thank you. And thank you for coming.
Yeah, and thanks everybody for watching.